The year is 1123. In the heart of Ireland, at the royal court of Turlough O'Connor, High King of Ireland, a master craftsman is putting the final touches on a magnificent object. It is a cross, but not just any cross. This is the Cross of Cong, designed to hold a fragment of the true cross. It is made of oak, covered in plates of bronze and silver, and adorned with intricate gold filigree and polished gemstones. It is a masterpiece of Irish Christian art, commissioned by a powerful Gaelic king. But as the craftsman, a man likely named Mael Isu Mac Bratton Ui Echak, inspects his work, he sees more than just his own tradition. He sees the legacy of his neighbors and sometimes enemies from across the sea. The swirling, interlocking patterns of animals on the cross, their bodies elongated and woven into complex knots, are not purely Irish. This is the ringarike style, a form of animal art that flourished in Scandinavia in the 11th century. It was a Viking art form. By 1123, the great Viking raids on Ireland were a memory, a story from the time of men's great-grandfathers. The Battle of Clontarf, often seen as the end of major Viking power in Ireland, was over a century in the past, fought in 1014. The Norse, who remained in Ireland, in cities like Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick, had become Hiberno-Norse. They were merchants, craftsmen, and Christians who spoke Gaelic and intermarried with the Irish. They were part of the fabric of the island. Yet their culture, their way of seeing the world and expressing it in art, had not vanished. It had blended. The craftsman finishing the Cross of Cong was not copying a Viking design. He was using a visual language that had become part of his own. The Mammon style, with its bold animal figures, and its successor, the ringarike style, had been so powerful and so admired that they seeped into the local art. This cross, a symbol of Irish faith and royal power, was also a quiet testament to a cultural exchange that went far beyond the violence of the raids. The Vikings had come with axes and longships, but they left behind ideas, words, laws, and a way of carving a beast onto a piece of metal. These were the things that endured long after the last raider sailed for home. Number 22, a man in a cold room preserved an entire world. Snorri Sturluson was a complicated man. Born in Iceland in 1179, he was ambitious, wealthy, and deeply involved in the turbulent politics of his time. He was a chieftain, a poet, and twice he was elected to the most powerful position in the Icelandic Commonwealth, the law speaker. As law speaker, he stood on the law rock at the Althing, the National Assembly, and was required to recite 1/3 of the nation's laws from memory each year. He was the living repository of his people's legal code, a tradition that stretched back to the first Viking settlers of Iceland. But Snorri's most enduring work was done away from the political stage, likely in the quiet of his study at his estate in Reykholt. The Viking Age was long over. The men who had sailed to Vinland and served in the Emperor's Guard in Constantinople were figures of legend. Their pagan religion had been replaced by Christianity over 200 years earlier. Their stories and myths were fading, preserved only in the complex oral poetry of the skalds. Snorri, a Christian man living in the 13th century, decided this could not stand. He feared that without understanding the old myths, future generations would not be able to understand the kennings and metaphors of the old poetry. So he wrote the Prose Edda, a handbook for poets that is now our single most important source for Norse mythology. He laid out the stories of Odin, Thor, and Loki, the creation of the world and its prophesied end at Ragnarok. He did not write as a believer, but as an antiquarian, a scholar preserving the intellectual heritage of his ancestors. And he also wrote, or at least is credited with writing, Heimskringla, a sweeping history of the kings of Norway from mythical beginnings up to his own time. He used old poems, oral traditions, and his own sharp historical sense to create a narrative that still shapes how we see the Viking Age. In 1241, Snorri's political enemies caught up with him. He was assassinated in his own home on the orders of the King of Norway. His political career ended in failure, but His work as a writer ensured that the culture of his ancestors did not fade away. The laws he recited at the Althing were a direct continuation of the Viking legal tradition. His writings, composed 2 centuries after the raids stopped, are the reason we know the stories we do. He was a 13th century politician who, almost by accident, became the chief librarian of the Viking world. Number 21, a fisherman named Grim founded a town. The legend is simple. Sometime in the 9th century, a Danish fisherman named Grim landed on the marshy coast of eastern England. He was a resourceful man, and he established a small settlement at a good spot on the Humber estuary. He had a ward, a young boy named Havelok, who turned out to be the lost son of the King of Denmark. The story is a medieval romance full of adventure and a bit of magic. But the part about Grim is likely rooted in a simple truth. A man named Grim, or someone with a similar Norse name, settled there. Centuries later, long after the Danelaw was a political reality, the evidence of Grim's presence was written on the map. The town that grew from that spot was called Grimsby. The BI suffix is Old Norse for farmstead or village. All across the north and east of England, the landscape is dotted with these names: Derby Deer Village, Whitby White Village, Rugby Rye Village. There are also names ending in Thorpe Outlying Farmstead, Thwaite Clearing, and Toft Homestead. These are not just names, they are linguistic fossils marking the land where Viking settlers put down roots. When William the Conqueror's clerks compiled the Domesday Book in 1086, they were not cataloging a Viking kingdom. They were assessing the land and wealth of Norman England. The Viking Age was over, yet on page after page they recorded these Norse place names. They recorded Grimsby, they recorded hundreds of others. These names were already old, established parts of the English landscape. They showed that the Viking influence was not just a matter of coastal raids, it was a matter of settlement, of families farming the land, raising children, and naming their new homes in their own language. The man named Grim may be a legend, but the town of Grimsby and hundreds like it are physical proof of the people who stayed. They changed the map of England, and the names they chose have outlasted empires. Number 20, a man sailed a buried ship to a new world. In 1880, the sons of a farmer at Gokstad in Norway began digging into a large burial mound on their land. They were looking for treasure. What they found was something far more valuable. They found a ship. It was a nearly perfectly preserved Viking ship, 23.8 meters long, built of clinker-laid oak planks. It had been buried around 890 AD. As the final resting place for a powerful chieftain, the Gokstad ship was a stunning archaeological find. It gave historians and naval architects a perfect, real-life example of the vessels that had carried Vikings across the seas. For nearly a century, the conventional wisdom was that these ships, with their low sides and open decks, were suitable for coastal waters and raids, but not for crossing the open Atlantic. They were elegant, but surely not true ocean-going vessels. A Norwegian journalist and adventurer named Magnus Andersen disagreed. He believed the sagas, he believed Leif Erikson had reached North America in a ship just like this one, and he decided to prove it. In 1892, using the exact measurements and construction techniques of the original, a replica of the Gokstad ship was built. Andersen named it the Viking. In 1893, he and a crew of 11 men set sail from Bergen, Norway, bound for the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. They faced storms and massive waves in the North Atlantic. Critics predicted they would be swamped and sunk within days, but the ship behaved beautifully. Its flexible hull twisted with the waves, its low freeboard allowed it to ride over the water, and its single square sail propelled it steadily westward. After 28 days, they made landfall in Newfoundland, just as Leif Erikson had done nearly 900 years before. They then sailed through the Great Lakes to Chicago, where they were a sensation. Magnus Andersen and his crew had done more than just sail a replica ship. They had proven that the technology of the 9th century was as sophisticated and effective as the legends claimed. They showed that the clinker building technique, a method of overlapping planks that the Vikings perfected, created a vessel of incredible strength and flexibility. And Anderson's journey in 1893 revived a deep understanding of Viking naval architecture, demonstrating that the skills of those ancient shipwrights were not primitive, but masterfully adapted to their purpose. Number 19, an English king and a Viking warlord changed how we speak. In the year 878, the situation was desperate for the English. A great heathen army of Danish Vikings had overrun most of the country. Only the Kingdom of Wessex, led by King Alfred, held out. After a surprise defeat, Alfred was forced into hiding in the marshes of Somerset. It seemed that England would become a Viking land, but Alfred was a brilliant and resilient leader. He regrouped, gathered his forces, and at the Battle of Edington, he won a decisive victory against the Viking army led by the warlord Guthrum. But Alfred did not drive the Vikings out. He did something much more pragmatic. In a treaty signed around 886, he and Guthrum formally divided England. The south and west would be Alfred's Wessex. The north and east would be a territory ruled by the Danes under their own laws. It became known as the Danelaw. This political solution had a profound and lasting cultural consequence. So it created a frontier, but also a zone of intense contact. For generations, people speaking Old English and people speaking Old Norse lived side by side. They traded, they argued, they intermarried, and they talked to each other. Their languages were related, both being Germanic, so they could understand each other to a degree, but they were different enough that communication required simplification and borrowing. The result was a creolization of English. Complex Old English grammatical endings were dropped, and a huge number of Old Norse words poured into the English vocabulary. These were not words of war or kingship, they were the words of everyday life. Words like sky, skin, leg, window. The pronoun they is from Old Norse. The verb are is from Old Norse. Common words like get, tak, and di are from Old Norse. When we speak modern English, we are speaking a language that was forged in the Danelaw. The treaty between Alfred and Guthrum, a political document from the late 9th century, set the stage for a linguistic merger that fundamentally reshaped English. It stripped the language down and rebuilt it with a huge infusion of Scandinavian vocabulary. The Vikings did not conquer England in the end, but their language became an inseparable part of the English tongue. Number 18, a man on a rock chose a new god to avoid a war. The year 1000 was a time of great tension in Iceland. The island nation, founded by Norse settlers a little over a century earlier, was divided. Some clans held to the old gods, to Odin and Thor. Others had converted to the new religion, Christianity, which was sweeping across Scandinavia. The two factions arrived at the annual assembly, the Althing, armed and ready to fight. Civil war seemed inevitable. The Althing was the heart of the Icelandic Commonwealth. It was an open-air parliament where free men gathered to make laws, settle disputes, and hold court. There was no king. The law was supreme. At this critical moment, the leaders of both factions agreed to turn the decision over to one man, the law speaker, Thorgeir Ljósvetnagadi. He was a pagan priest, or Godi, but he was known for his wisdom and fairness. Thorgeir accepted the heavy burden. He went to his tent, and as the sagas tell it, he lay down under a fur blanket and did not speak for a day and a night. He was thinking, he was weighing the fate of his nation. The next day, he came out and went to the Logberg, the Law Rock. He delivered his verdict. Iceland would become a Christian nation. All people should be baptized, but he added crucial compromises. People could still sacrifice to the old gods in private. The old practices of exposing unwanted infants and eating horse meat, which were forbidden by the church, would still be permitted. He argued that the worst thing for the nation was to be divided by two laws. It will be true, he said, that if we sunder the law, we will also sunder the peace. His decision was accepted. Civil war was averted. The story of Thorgeir's choice is a remarkable example of the Viking legal and political tradition in action. The Althing, founded in 930, was one of the world's first parliaments. It operated on principles of consensus, arbitration, and the rule of law. The crisis of the year 1000 was not solved by a king's decree or a battle, but by a legal process and a carefully negotiated compromise delivered by a trusted official. The Althing itself survived for centuries, and its modern successor is the Parliament of Iceland today. The system of governance the Vikings created in Iceland proved resilient enough to peacefully navigate the single most divisive issue of the age. Number 17, a farmer in a Swedish forest carved a message in a forgotten script. In the 16th century, a farmer in the Swedish province of Dalarna needed to remember something. Perhaps it was a date or a note about his property. He didn't use the Latin alphabet that was common throughout Sweden and the rest of Europe. Instead, he took out his knife and carved a series of sharp, angular characters into a piece of wood. He was using runes. These were not the ancient runes of the Viking Age. They were Dalecarlian runes, a modified version of the old Futhark that had survived and evolved in this one isolated corner of Sweden. While the rest of Scandinavia had adopted the Latin alphabet, with the coming of Christianity, Dalarna remained a place apart. It was a region of deep forests, independent-minded farmers, and strong traditions. Here, the runic script didn't die out. It was passed down from generation to generation. People used it for everyday purposes. They carved it onto their furniture, their bowls, and their houses. They used runic calendars, complex wooden staffs that tracked the days of the year. The farmer carving his message was not performing some ancient pagan ritual. He was using a practical, living script. The use of Dalecarlian runes continued for an astonishingly long time. There are examples of people using them well into the 19th century. A man named Erik Johansson, born in 1827 in the parish of Alvdalen, was known to be able to read and write in runes. This was at a time when the rest of the world was communicating by telegraph. The survival of runes in Dalarna is a striking example of how a piece of Viking culture could persist in a small, isolated community. It wasn't an academic revival. It was an unbroken, living tradition that lasted for nearly 1,000 years after the end of the Viking Age. It shows that the old ways didn't just vanish sometimes, they just went into the woods and quietly carried on. Number 16, an archaeologist in Sweden found a Buddha under a farmhouse. In the 1950s, archaeologists were excavating a site on the small island of Helgö in Lake Mälaren, Sweden. For centuries it had been the site of a royal farm, but beneath the farm they found something much older, the remains of a major trading and craft center from the Viking Age and the centuries just before it. They found workshops for smiths and jewelers and thousands of artifacts. It was a treasure trove, but one discovery, made by the archaeologist Wilhelm Holmqvist, stood out as truly extraordinary. Among the shards of glass and bits of local metalwork, his team found a small bronze statuette of the Buddha. It was of a style common in Kashmir in northern India and dated to around the 6th century. How did a statue of the Buddha made in the Himalayas end up on a small island in Sweden more than 1,400 years ago? It was a puzzle that highlighted the incredible reach of the Viking trade networks. The men we call Vikings were not just raiders. They were perhaps the greatest traders and explorers of their age. The man who brought that Buddha to Helgö was part of a vast network that connected Scandinavia to the wider world. He or his ancestors had traveled the rivers of what is now Russia and Ukraine. They called themselves the Rus, and the rivers were their highways. As they sailed down the Dnieper to the Black Sea and the great city of Constantinople, which they called Miklagard. They sailed down the Volga to the Caspian Sea, trading with the Arab Caliphate. They sought silver, silks, spices, and glass. They traded furs, amber, walrus ivory, and slaves. The Buddha statue found by Holmqvist was a silent passenger on these trade routes. Perhaps an Arab merchant traded it for furs, and a Rus merchant then carried it north on the long journey back to Sweden. It was not a religious item to him, it was a curious piece of metal, an exotic good. The discovery at Helgö fundamentally changed our understanding of the Viking world. It showed that their horizons were not limited to the North Atlantic. They were a key link in a global trade network that stretched from Ireland to India. These trade routes, established during the Viking Age, did not disappear. They laid the groundwork for the later trade of the Hanseatic League and connected Northern Europe to the rest of the world in a way that persisted for centuries. Number 15, a master carver, wrapped a church in a dragon's embrace. Around the year 1130, in a steep, remote valley in western Norway, a new church was being built. This was the Ernest Stave Church. Norway had been officially Christian for over a century, and the old pagan beliefs were fading. The church was being built in a new style, the Stave Church, a complex wooden structure with a framework of massive posts or staves. It was a Christian building for a Christian congregation, but the master carver who was tasked with decorating the north portal had not forgotten the old ways. He took his tools and began to carve into the wooden panels. What emerged was not a scene from the Bible or a host of Christian saints. It was a breathtakingly complex and beautiful design of swirling, interlaced animals. A four-legged, deer-like creature is shown being bitten by and entangled with serpents and dragon-like beasts. The lines are fluid, elegant, and full of tension. The animals' bodies are elongated and ribbon-like, weaving in and out of each other in a graceful, endless struggle. This was the urn style, the final, most refined phase of Viking art. The carver was a Christian working on a church, but his artistic vocabulary, his sense of form and beauty was purely Scandinavian. He was taking the art form that had decorated runestones and sword hilts and applying it to the house of the new god. The scene on the portal is often interpreted as a Christian allegory, representing the struggle between good the deer-like creature, sometimes seen as Christ and evil the serpents, or Satan, but its visual language is a direct descendant of the art that adorned Viking longships. The Ernstave Church, which still stands today and is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, is a physical monument to cultural fusion. It shows that the conversion to Christianity did not erase the old culture overnight. Instead, the two blended. The artistic traditions of the Viking Age were so powerful and so deeply ingrained that they were adapted to serve the new faith. The master carver of Ernest, whose name is lost to history, created a masterpiece that looked both forward to a Christian future and back to a pagan Viking past. Number 14, a king of England, had a Viking's name and a Viking's fate.
Harold Godwinson was born around 1022. His father, Godwin, was the most powerful earl in England. His mother, Ytha, was the sister of a Danish jarl who was married to the sister of King Tut the Great.
Harold's own name was Scandinavian. He was an English nobleman, but he was also a product of the deep Norse influence on the English aristocracy. Well, for decades, England had been part of a North Sea empire ruled by Danish kings like Knut. The line between English and Danish nobility had blurred. In January 1066, King Edward the Confessor died childless. The English Council of Nobles, the Witan, chose Harold Godwinson to be the next King of England. He was a proven military leader and the most powerful man in the kingdom, but his claim was immediately challenged by two other men, both of whom were also descendants of Vikings. One was William, Duke of Normandy. The Normans were Northmen who had settled in France a century and a half earlier. The other was Harold Sigurdsson, known as Hardrada the Hard Ruler, the King of Norway. In September 1066, Harald Hardrada invaded northern England. He was a fearsome figure, a man who had served as a mercenary in the Byzantine Varangian Guard and had fought his way to the Norwegian throne. He was, in many ways, the last great Viking king. Harold Godwinson marched his English army north at incredible speed and met the Norwegian invaders at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. The English won a crushing victory. Harold Hardrada was killed, and his army was shattered. It was the end of the large-scale Viking invasions of England. But just 3 days later, William of Normandy landed his army on the south coast. Harold Godwinson had to force march his exhausted army 240 miles south to meet the new threat. And on October 14th, 1066, at the Battle of Hastings, the English army was defeated and Harold was killed. The story of 1066 is the story of three Viking descendants fighting for the crown of England. Harold Godwinson, the English king with a Norse name, defeated the last Viking invasion only to be defeated by a man whose own great-great-great-grandfather, Rollo, was a Viking chieftain. The year 1066 is often seen as the end of the Viking Age, but it was also its culmination, a final, bloody struggle for power between the heirs of the Viking world. Number 13, two skiers saved a kingdom in the middle of a blizzard. In the winter of 1206, Norway was torn apart by civil war. Two factions, the Birkebeiners and the Baglers, were fighting for the throne. The Birkebeiners controlled the east, but their king had just died, leaving behind an infant son, Hakon Hakonsson, who was not yet 2 years old. The Baglers were closing in, determined to kill the child and end the rival dynasty. The baby prince was in hiding in Lillehammer, but his location had been discovered. He had to be moved to safety in Trondheim, hundreds of miles to the north, across treacherous snow-covered mountains. A small group of Birkebeiner warriors was entrusted with the task, but the weather turned against them. A massive blizzard swept in, making travel impossible for the main party. The life of the prince was in extreme danger. Two men, the best skiers in the group, stepped forward. Their names were Torstein Skevla and Skirvald Skruka. They knew they could travel faster on skis than any horseman. They wrapped the small child in their cloaks and set off, skiing directly into the blizzard, across the mountains from the Gudbrandsdalen Valley over to the Osterdaland Valley. It was an epic journey of endurance and courage. They fought their way through blinding snow and bitter cold, protecting the future king of Norway. They succeeded. They brought the child to safety, and he grew up to become King Hakon IV, one of Norway's greatest medieval rulers who finally brought the civil wars to an end. The story of the Birkebeiners saving the prince became a foundational legend for Norway. It celebrated the quintessential Norwegian virtues of courage, endurance, and skill on skis. For the Vikings and their medieval descendants, skis were not for sport. They were an essential tool for transportation and warfare in the harsh northern winter. The tale of Torstein and Skirvald's desperate cross-country rescue immortalized this. Today, their journey is commemorated every year in the Birkebeinerrennet, one of the world's most famous cross-country ski races, where thousands of skiers race the same route, many carrying a weighted pack to symbolize the weight of the young prince. The race is a living link to a 13th century act of heroism and the long Scandinavian tradition of life on skis. Number 12, an archaeologist dug up a town and found it was clean. For centuries, the popular image of Vikings was one of filth and savagery. They were seen as hairy, unwashed barbarians who stormed ashore, reeking of sweat and blood. But in the late 1970s, archaeologists began a series of excavations in the city of York, in an area called Coppergate. This was the site of Jorvik, the Viking capital of northern England. What they found, under the direction of archaeologist Richard Hall, completely overturned the old stereotype. As they dug down through the layers of history, they uncovered the remarkably well-preserved remains of the 10th century Viking city. The waterlogged, oxygen-poor soil had preserved organic materials that usually rot away wood, leather, textiles, and even insects. They found the remains of houses, workshops, and fences, but they also found vast numbers of very personal items. They found combs, hundreds of them, made of bone and antler, many with intricate decorations. They found tweezers, ear spoons for cleaning wax from ears, and bone manicure sets. The evidence was overwhelming. The Vikings of Jorvik were obsessed with personal grooming. Arab travelers who met them, like Ibn Fadlan in the 10th century, remarked on their cleanliness. He noted that they combed their hair every day. English chroniclers complained that the Vikings' habit of bathing once a week, on Saturdays the Scandinavian Lagerdager, or washing day, gave them an unfair advantage with English women. The excavations at Coppergate provided the hard physical evidence to back up these accounts. Richard Hall and his team didn't just find a few combs. They found a society where grooming was a central part of daily life. They also found evidence of organized city life with planned streets, property boundaries, and specialized craft areas. The dirty Viking was a myth, likely a product of propaganda from the monks whose monasteries were being raided. The reality, revealed by the patient work of archaeologists in York, was of a sophisticated, urban people who liked to keep themselves neat and tidy. And number 11, a farm woman's recipe, became a global health food. In a turf-roofed farmhouse in 12th century Iceland, a woman is making skyr. The process is ancient, passed down through generations. She takes skimmed milk, heats it, and then adds a small amount of old skyr from the last batch. This precious spoonful contains the living bacterial cultures that will transform the milk. She lets it sit and thicken, then strains it through a cloth bag to remove the whey. The result is a thick, tangy, protein-rich substance, almost like a cheese, but eaten like a yogurt. It is a vital part of the Icelandic diet, a way of preserving milk and providing crucial nutrition through the long, dark winters. Skyr is mentioned in the Icelandic sagas. In Egil's saga, which was written down in the 13th century but describes events from the 9th and 10th centuries, there is a scene where Egil is served a bowl of skyr so thick it has to be broken up. For 1,000 years, skyr was an Icelandic secret, a staple food made in every farmhouse. The specific cultures of bacteria and yeast used to make it were passed down like a family heirloom, a living link to the past. In the early 20th century, as Iceland began to industrialize, the production of skyr moved from the farm to dairies. But they still use the same traditional methods and the same heirloom cultures. An Icelandic scientist named Eiríkur Sigurdsson was instrumental in preserving and understanding these unique bacterial cultures. For most of the 20th century, skyr remained a local Icelandic product. Then, in the early 21st century, the world discovered it. Marketed as a healthy, high-protein superfood, Icelandic skyr became a global phenomenon. It started appearing in supermarkets in Europe, North America, and beyond. The product that is now sold in plastic pots around the world is made using the same basic principles and often the same strains of bacteria as the skyr made by that farm woman 900 years ago. It is a direct, edible link to the Viking Age. The diet and food preservation techniques of the Norse settlers in Iceland proved to be so effective and nutritious that they have thrived in the modern world. Number 10, a law passed in 982 created a unique animal. Sometime around the year 982, the Icelandic Althing made a critical decision. They passed a law banning the importation of horses to Iceland. The reasons were practical. Imported animals could bring diseases that would devastate the existing livestock on the isolated island. And perhaps there was a sense that the horses they already had were good enough. They were the horses the first Viking settlers had brought with them from Norway over a century before, small, sturdy, and well adapted to the harsh landscape. That single law, passed over 1,000 years ago, had a profound and lasting effect. It created a genetic bubble. For the next millennium, the horses of Iceland were completely isolated from all other horse breeds in the world. They were a time capsule, a living relic of the horses the Vikings rode. While horse breeds elsewhere were crossbred for size, speed, or strength, the Icelandic horse remained unchanged. As a result, it preserved unique traits. Most horse breeds have 3 gaits walk, trot, and canter gallop. The Icelandic horse has 5. It also has the tolt, an incredibly smooth 4-beat gait that allows a rider to cover rough ground quickly and comfortably. Some also have the flying pace, a fast lateral gait used for racing. These gaits were likely common in Viking Age horses, but have been bred out of most modern breeds. The law passed by the Althing in 982 was not a conscious effort to create a unique breed. It was a practical piece of agricultural legislation. But its consequence was the preservation of a piece of the Viking world in living form. When you see an Icelandic horse today, you are seeing an animal that is virtually identical to the ones that carried the first settlers across the island, the ones that Snorri Sturluson would have ridden, and the ones that appear in the sagas. And it is a direct, 4-legged link to the past, protected for over 1,000 years by a single far-sighted law. Number 9, A Man on a Mission, saved his nation's stories from a fire. By the late 17th century, the great literary treasures of Iceland were in peril. The medieval manuscripts of the sagas written on vellum were scattered across the country. They were kept in damp farmhouses and decaying churches. Some were being used as insoles for shoes. Others were cut up to be used as patterns for clothing. The stories of Egil Skallagrimsson, Gunnar of Hlíðarendi, and the settlement of Iceland were literally turning to dust. An Icelandic scholar named Árni Magnússon, born in 1663, made it his life's work to stop this destruction. He was a professor at the University of Copenhagen, but he spent years traveling through the Icelandic countryside on horseback, going from farm to farm. He was a relentless collector. He begged, borrowed, and bought every old piece of vellum he could find. He understood that these were not just old books. They were the soul of his nation, the record of its history, language, and culture. His work was a race against time. In 1728, a great fire swept through Copenhagen, destroying much of the city, including a large part of the university library. Árni's own house and collection were in the path of the flames. He and his helpers worked frantically to save the manuscripts. They managed to get most of them out, carrying them in crates through the burning streets. Some were damaged, but the core of the collection was saved. Yeah, it was a cultural rescue mission on an epic scale. When Árni Magnússon died in 1730, he bequeathed his entire collection to the university. The Arnamagnæan manuscript collection is now one of the most important collections of medieval manuscripts in the world. It is because of Árni's obsessive lifelong quest that we have the texts of most of the Icelandic sagas. He was not a Viking. He was a quiet, determined scholar who lived 700 years after the Viking Age. But without him, our knowledge of that age would be immeasurably poorer. He single-handedly saved the stories that define it. Number 8, a teacher explains the gods to children every week. In a primary school classroom in York, England, a teacher is helping her students learn the days of the week. On Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. The children repeat the words. The teacher explains that the names have meanings. She tells them that Tuesday comes from Tuesday, an old English god of war, and then she gets to the middle of the week. Wednesday, she says, is for a god named Woden. He was the king of the gods. Then Thursday is for a god named Thor. He was the god of thunder and had a magic hammer. She might not know it, but she is channeling the Viking Age directly into her classroom. Woden is the Old English name for the Norse god Odin. Thor is, of course, Thor. When Norse-speaking Vikings settled in the Danelaw, they brought their gods and their names for the days of the week with them. The English already had a similar system, naming days after their own Germanic gods: Tiw, Woden, Thunor, Frigg. The Norse and English systems were so similar that they reinforced each other. The legacy of these gods is now embedded in the very structure of our week. Sunday and Monday are named for the sun and moon, but the heart of the work week belongs to the gods of Asgard. Tuesday is for Tyr, Wednesday is for Odin, Thursday is for Thor, Friday is for Frigg, Odin's wife. These are not just historical curiosities. They are words used by billions of people every day. The teacher in York doesn't need to be an expert in Norse mythology. The culture is built into the language she speaks. Every time someone looks at their calendar and plans a meeting for Thursday, they are unknowingly invoking the name of the Viking god of thunder. The raids stopped, the longships rotted away, and the temples to Odin were replaced by churches. But the names of the gods survived, hidden in plain sight in the most common of words. Number 7. A King's Law. Built a justice system on a Viking idea. In 1166, King Henry II of England issued a set of laws known as the Assize of Clarendon. It was a major step in the development of the English legal system. One of its key provisions was the establishment of a system for dealing with criminals. It decreed that a body of 12 lawful men from the local area should be put under oath to report any person accused or suspected of serious crimes. This body was a forerunner of the modern grand jury. It was a jury of one's neighbors, of one's peers. Where did this idea come from? While it had roots in Norman and older English traditions, it was heavily influenced and reinforced by the legal customs of the Danelaw. For centuries, the Scandinavian settlers in northern and eastern England had run their own legal affairs based on their own traditions. A central part of this was the idea of judgment by a panel of free men. In the sagas, legal disputes are often settled by juries. At the Thing assemblies, panels of neighbors would rule on cases. The idea that a person should be judged by their community, not just by a single lord or priest, was deeply ingrained in Norse legal culture. Henry II was a brilliant and practical king. He wanted to create a unified and effective legal system for his entire kingdom. He saw the utility of the jury system that was already functioning in the former Danelaw and formalized it, making it the law of the land. This was the beginning of the English common law tradition that would spread across the world. The idea that you have a right to be tried by a jury of your peers is a cornerstone of modern justice in many countries. This fundamental legal right has a clear line of descent from the practices of Viking settlers. The farmers and merchants of the Danelaw, trying to resolve disputes over land or stolen cattle, used a system that, when adopted by a powerful king, grew into a global principle of justice. The legacy of the Viking Thing system wasn't just in Iceland, it was woven into the very fabric of English law. Number 6. A woman found a needle and rewrote a chapter of history. In 1960, a Norwegian explorer and writer named Helgi Ingstad was searching for the answer to a 1,000-year-old riddle from the saga's Vinland. He and his wife, an archaeologist named Anne Steen Ingstad, were convinced that the Norse had reached North America centuries before Columbus. Following the descriptions in the sagas, they focused their search on the northern tip of Newfoundland, in Canada. At a place called Lonsdale Meadows, a local fisherman showed them a series of overgrown mounds that looked strangely familiar. Anne Stein Ingstad began to excavate. Over the next several years, she and her team uncovered the remains of a small settlement. They found the foundations of longhouses built of turf, identical in style to those found in Norse Greenland and Iceland. They found a smithy with a stone anvil and slag from iron smelting, a technology unknown to the native peoples of the time. This was it. This was Vinland. But one of the most important discoveries was not a dramatic weapon or a piece of a ship. It was a small, unassuming object found by Anne Stein in 1964. It was a spindle hurl made of soapstone. A spindle hurl is a weight used for spinning yarn. It is an everyday tool, and it is a tool used exclusively by women. Later, they also found a bone needle. These small finds were revolutionary. They proved that the settlement at Lonsdale Meadows was not just a temporary camp for male explorers or raiders. The presence of women and the tools for making textiles meant that this was a true attempt at colonization. It was a settlement of families trying to build a new life in a new world. It meant that Norse women had crossed the Atlantic in open boats alongside the men. The discovery of that one small stone disc, a tool for a craft practiced by women for millennia, changed the entire story. It humanized the Vinland settlement, showing that the full spectrum of Norse society, not just the warriors, made that incredible journey. Number 5, a musician heard the sound of a farmhouse instrument. For centuries, the music of the Viking Age was silent. We had descriptions of instruments in the sagas and a few archaeological fragments, but no one knew what the music actually sounded like. Then, in a 14th century farmhouse on the Kravik farm in Norway, an instrument was found. It was a lyre, a type of stringed instrument with a distinctive shape. The Kraviklira, as it became known, was a medieval instrument, but its design was much older, stretching back into the Viking Age and beyond. It was a tangible link to a lost soundscape. For a long time, the Kraviklira and other similar finds were museum pieces, objects to be looked at, not played. But in recent decades, a new generation of musicians and instrument makers has sought to bring them back to life. A Norwegian musician named Einar Selvik, the founder of the musical project Wardruna, is one of the most prominent figures in this revival. Selvik was not content to just read about the past. He wanted to hear it. He worked with instrument makers to create faithful reconstructions of historical instruments like the Kraviklira and the tegelharpa, a bowed lyre. He studied the old poetry, the runes, and the sagas to understand the concepts and themes that were important to the pre-Christian Norse people. He then began to compose new music using these ancient instruments and a vocal style inspired by traditional Scandinavian folk singing. His music is not an exact recreation of Viking Age music. That is impossible to achieve, but it is a powerful and evocative interpretation, an attempt to connect with the spirit and sound of the past. Through the work of musicians like Einar Selvik, the Kravaklira is no longer a silent artifact in a glass case. It is a living instrument, its strings vibrating with music that resonates with millions of listeners around the world. This revival has given a voice back to the Viking Age, allowing us to hear a shadow of the music that was played in longhouses and at ceremonies over 1,000 years ago. Number 4, a craftsman on Coppergate lived in a planned city. Imagine a man in the 10th century walking down a street in the city of Jorvik. He is a craftsman, perhaps an antler carver. He walks to his workshop, which is at the front of a long, narrow plot of land. His house is at the back of the same plot. His neighbor is a leather worker with his own identical plot of land. The street they are on, which we now call Coppergate, the street of the cup makers, is a bustling commercial hub. The layout is not random. It is a planned, gridded city. This picture is not fantasy. It is the reality that was uncovered by archaeologists digging in York. Before the Vikings arrived, the old Roman city of Iberacum was largely in ruins. When the Vikings captured it in 866 and made it their capital, they did not just set up a chaotic camp. Though they were master urban planners, they laid out a new street grid with main thoroughfares and smaller side streets. They divided the land into long, narrow property plots called burgage plots. These plots with a narrow frontage on the street for a workshop or shop and a long area behind for a house and yard were a remarkably efficient way to organize a commercial city. The craftsmen of Jorvik specialized. Archaeologists found areas for metalworking, for glass bead making, for textile production, and for carving bone and antler into the famous combs. The city was a center of international trade, with goods coming in from the Baltic, the Middle East, and beyond. It was a vibrant, multicultural, and well-organized metropolis. The influence of this Viking urban planning is still visible in York today. The medieval streets, like the shambles, still follow the lines of the Old Norse city. The concept of the long, narrow burgage plots shaped the development of the city for the next 1,000 years and can still be traced in property maps. The Vikings who founded Jorvik were not just destroyers, they were builders. They created a model of urban organization that was so successful and practical that its ghost still shapes the modern city of York. Number 3, a Christian king moved a pagan party. Hakon the Good was a Norwegian king with a complicated identity. He was born around 920, the son of King Harald Fairhair, who unified Norway. But as a boy, he was sent to be fostered at the court of King Athelstan of England. There, he was raised as a Christian. When he returned to Norway to claim the throne, he was a Christian king, ruling a largely pagan country. According to the saga written by Snorri Sturluson, Hakon wanted to convert his people, but he met with fierce resistance. He had to tread carefully. One of his most clever and lasting moves involved a party. The most important festival in the pagan Norse calendar was Yule. It was a midwinter feast that lasted for several days, involving sacrifices, feasting, drinking, and celebrating the turn of the season. It was a deeply ingrained cultural tradition. Hakon knew he could not simply ban it. So, he made a law. His law decreed that the Christian celebration of Christmas should be held at the same time as the pagan Yule. Every man was required to brew a measure of ale and keep the holiday holy as long as the ale lasted. In effect, he merged the two festivals. He took the energy, the traditions, and the timing of the old pagan feast and attached them to the new Christian one. It was an act of cultural syncretism, blending two traditions into one. This is why many of the traditions we now associate with Christmas have pagan roots. The Yule log, the feasting, the evergreen decorations, these all echo the older midwinter celebrations. Hakon's decision, a political compromise made by a 10th century king, had consequences that have lasted for over 1,000 years. He successfully Christianized the festival without destroying it. He simply gave the old party a new name. The cultural DNA of the Viking Yule feast is still present in Christmas celebrations across the world. Number 2, a man in Shetland built a boat like his ancestors. In the 20th century, on the Shetland Islands, a boat builder named Duncan Sanderson would go to work building a yawl. The Shetland yawl is a light, fast, 6-oared boat, perfectly designed for the often rough seas around the islands. For generations, it was the primary boat used for fishing. Duncan Sanderson built his yawls in the traditional way, the way his father and grandfather had built them. It was a method that was ancient. He would lay down the keel, then attach the stems at the front and back. Then he would begin adding the planks, the strakes. He would overlap each plank with the one below it, fastening them together with copper rivets. This is called clinker construction. The result is a light, strong, and flexible hull that can ride the waves beautifully. It is also the exact same method that the Vikings used to build their longships over 1,000 years earlier. When the first Norse settlers arrived in Shetland around 800 AD, they came in clinker-built ships. They settled, and for the next 600 years, Shetland was a Norwegian earldom. The Norse language Norn was spoken there until the 18th century, and the Norse way of building boats never left. The Shetland yawl is a direct, living descendant of the Viking longship. It has been adapted and scaled down for local fishing rather than long-distance raiding, but its fundamental design and construction are the same. It is a piece of Viking technology that has been in continuous use for over 1,200 years. Men like Duncan Sanderson were not historical reenactors. They were working craftsmen, building boats for fishermen to make a living. They were preserving a tradition not out of a sense of history, but because it worked. The clinker-built design perfected by the Vikings was so well suited to the conditions of the North Atlantic that it was never bettered. It is a testament to the sheer quality and practicality of Viking naval engineering. Number 1, a prince became a mercenary and returned as a king. Around the year 1030, a young Norwegian prince named Harald Sigurdsson was forced to flee his homeland. He was only 15. His half-brother, King Olaf, had been killed in the Battle of Stiklestad, and Harald was wounded and on the losing side. He was in exile with nothing. He made his way east through the land of the Rus, following the old Viking trade routes. His destination was the greatest city in the world, Constantinople, or Miklagard as the Norse called it. There he joined the most elite mercenary unit in the Byzantine Emperor's army, the Varangian Guard. This was a force composed almost entirely of Norsemen and Rus. For the next decade, Harald fought for the Emperor. He battled pirates in the Aegean, fought Arabs in Sicily and Anatolia, and even went on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He rose through the ranks, becoming a commander, and he amassed an enormous fortune in plunder and pay. The sagas say he sent his wealth north for safekeeping with the Prince of Kiev. He was a fearsome and brilliant soldier, but he never forgot who he was. Around 1045, he left Constantinople and returned to Norway. With the vast wealth he had earned as a Varangian, he was able to make a deal with his nephew, the current king, to become co-ruler. When his nephew died a year later, Harald became the sole king of Norway. He was now known as Harald Hardrada, the Hard Ruler. Harald's story shows the enduring importance of the Eastern connection for the Viking world. Long after the raids on Western Europe had waned, the path to Constantinople remained a route to fame and fortune. The Varangian Guard served the Byzantine emperors for centuries, a direct continuation of the Viking martial tradition. Harald Hardrada brought the military experience and the immense wealth of the Byzantine world back to Scandinavia and used it to reshape the political landscape. He was a product of the post-raiding era, a man whose career was built on the networks the Vikings had established. In his life, from exiled prince to elite mercenary to powerful king, is a perfect example of how the influence and opportunities created by the Viking Age continued to shape the world long after the classic Viking Age was over.